So Unit 2, we'll talk about energy and Earth systems. Specifically, we're going to get through and talk about Earth's energy and its budget. Remember that if I was to talk a little bit about a budget, as far as you going to the mall, you'd probably be talking about the amount of money that you have available to you. We're also going to talk about non-renewable resources, fossil fuels, types of coal, oil traps, fossil fuel supplies, nuclear energy, a nuclear fission reaction, and also parts of a nuclear reactor. So Earth's energy budget. The transfers of energy between Earth's spheres can be thought of as part of a budget, an energy budget. Every day we have the same amount of solar radiation that hits our planet. Not all locations on the planet have the same amount of energy each day. However, the planet as a whole does end up with the same amount of energy each day. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy is transferred between systems, but it cannot be created or destroyed. We've seen this before. For example, when we were in the chemistry unit and I was talking about how we can take paper and we can change its mass. We don't really change the mass of the paper because the paper basically becomes less organized. The matter moves to a different location. It turns into a gas. Energy is very much the same way. We don't create or destroy energy, we just allow it to change forms. Specifically, the time that I burned paper in class, we saw where that energy changed form into heat and light. The second law of thermodynamics states that when energy transfer occurs, matter becomes less organized. So back to the paper example, as paper is burning, the matter that made it up became less and less organized. The molecules of that paper spread out. They turned to a gas. They ended up floating around in the atmosphere. They are less organized at that time than they were when they were in the paper form. The constant exchange of matter and energy between Earth's spheres happens through chemical reactions, radioactive decay, the radiation of energy, and the growth and decay of organisms. So looking at these examples, chemical reactions. Your body is going through chemical reactions right now. And as your body is going through a respiration reaction and a number of other chemical reactions, your body is giving off heat. The growth and decay of organisms. As you grow, you are going to store energy. Specifically, our body likes to store energy in fats. So we take that energy, we store it for later use. We use that energy for the growth of our body. Now when our bodies grow, it's not really that our cells are getting a whole lot bigger in order for us to grow. Really what's happening is our cells are copying themselves and making new copies. If you've ever broken a growth plate on one of your bones in your body, that growth plate is an area where cells actively divide very quickly. So what happens is they're worried about when you break a growth plate, they're worried about it interrupting that growth of cells. As cells grow in the growth plate, it causes the bone to elongate. There's more cells cause the bone to be longer. The larger the bone is, the more you grow. Radioactive decay happens with a number of different things within our planet. Things give off heat as they decay radioactively. And then the inside of our planet radiates heat as well. The interior of our planet is warm. That energy is released slowly through the surface of our planet, and it's radiated off into space. Alright, looking at this figure. This should be in your notes. We're going to talk through this entire figure. Each day, our planet gets 100% of the incoming solar radiation that it's going to get. The sun does not give off more or less energy each day. Alright, the sun's energy is constant. It's kind of like taking a flashlight. You take a flashlight and you shine it on an object and you just leave it run. That flashlight's not giving off more energy the longer you let it run. It's not giving off less energy the more you let it run. Now, if you let it run for day upon day upon day, eventually it's going to run out of battery energy, and so then it's going to just shut off. But that length of time, from the time you turn it on until the time you shut it off, it's giving off the same amount of energy. Our sun works exactly the same way. Of the 100% of energy that we get from the sun, 16% is absorbed by water vapor, dust, ozone, and carbon dioxide. 3% is absorbed by the clouds. 16 plus 3 equals what? 19. Where do we see 19 on there? 19% is absorbed by the atmosphere. So 19% is the product of these two things. The energy that's being absorbed by water vapor, dust, ozone, and carbon dioxide, along with the energy that's being absorbed by clouds. So 19% is absorbed by our atmosphere. 51% is absorbed by water and land. 51 plus 19 equals what? 70. 70. Where on here do we see 70? 70% is re-radiated as long-wave radiation. What is the Cliff Notes version of long-wave radiation? What is long-wave radiation? Because we've talked a little bit about it before, but we use more of a basic term for long-wave radiation than we do the long-term long-wave radiation. No, not reflection. It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but it's not electromagnetic spectrum in itself. Looking for a shortened version of long-wave radiation. Nope, not ultraviolet rays. It's another name for thermal energy. Heat energy. Long-wave radiation is heat energy. So we'll notice we have 70% being absorbed by our planet. But also we give off 70% of the energy that is absorbed by our planet. Why is this important? Why would it be important for our planet to release the 70% of the long-wave radiation that it also absorbed at an earlier time? How would it hurt us?
Radiation in the ground.
Not radiation in the ground. There we go. It would get too warm. So if our planet constantly was absorbing that 70% of the energy that hits it each day in and day out, and it did not re-radiate some of that heat back off, our planet would continue to heat uncontrolled, and it would get warmer and warmer and warmer. So we have to release the energy that we absorb. If we don't release the energy that we absorb, we have an excess amount of energy.
Like if you're using like a data system too long and half of it gets cut and then power down and cool off.
Could be. So you're using like your Xbox or your PlayStation or whatever. Over time, it's going to continue to heat up more and more and more. There has to be a way for that system to lose that energy that it's absorbed from it operating. They build fans into it to try to help that process to occur. Sometimes the fans don't work the best. They don't remove enough heat. Therefore, the system as a whole ends up overheating. The same thing can happen on our planet if we did not re-radiate heat off into space. All right. Also looking up here, we have 6% of the solar radiation that's scattered by air. 20% is reflected by clouds. 4% is reflected by water and land. 6 plus 20 plus 4 equals 30. 30% of the energy that we have that comes in contact with our planet is reflected back off into space. The reflectivity of our planet is called our planet's albedo. Albedo is the reflectivity of an object. Now let me ask this question. We know that each day we have 100% incoming solar radiation coming into our planet. That does not change. On a local level, can we change these other things? Is 6% always scattered by air? Is 20% always reflected by clouds? 4% always reflected by water and land? Or can we increase or decrease those percentages? How? Yes, we can increase and decrease those things. How can we do that? Ah, very good. So some days we have excess cloud cover. Clouds are what color? White. We know that white objects like to do what? They like to reflect. Darker objects like to absorb light energy. So we know that if we've got an excess amount of cloud cover, this amount of reflected, right here, this amount of reflected energy by clouds is going to increase on a local level. So let's continue with this. Can we change this amount right here? The amount that is absorbed by the atmosphere or the amount that is absorbed by water and land? Can we increase or decrease those two? So we're saying yes, we can in the atmosphere with clouds. Can we do it on our surface?
Yes.
How?
If there's no clouds in the sky, then all the sunlight is coming down into the water.
Okay, so no clouds may cause a change. We already mentioned no clouds, but is there something that maybe is on the surface that could change that? Why don't we open up the window right now? Go ahead and open that window up. Cover your eyes. So we've got a nice sunny day today, right? And it almost makes you have to squint when you look outside. Why do we need to squint when we're looking outside on a day like today?
Just because it's reflecting off the snow.
Because there's a large amount of reflectivity from the snow. So there's this interesting thing that happens with regard to snow. Snow increases the albedo of our planet. So it increases the reflectivity. So in the northern hemisphere right now, a lot of energy is being reflected. There's not a lot of surfaces that are absorbing energy right now because of the sheer amount of snow cover.
That's why it can stay so much cooler.
That's why winters tend to stay quite a bit cooler. And we don't have quite as much of a fluctuation in temperatures during winters. We don't have those days where it gets to be 95 degrees and then we've got other days where it's in the 60s. Right? Now we do have extremes sometimes when we get the negatives, but for the most part, we don't have extreme temperatures during the winter because it's constantly reflecting off energy. Now in the springtime, we start noticing a big difference in temperatures, partially because of the mixing of air masses, but also we notice that our snow starts speeding up with regard to the speed at which it melts. It's because when we have surfaces that are open to sunlight, for example, the ground, we get a small amount of melting and the ground is open, it's darker in color. There's more energy being absorbed. As more energy is being absorbed, the ground warms up. As the ground warms up, what happens? Snow melts. And this process happens much quicker in those smaller areas where the snow is able to open up. If you go inside of a woods where there's a good canopy, a good cover over top of the snow, it kind of insulates the snow and the snow doesn't heat up and melt as quickly as what it does in open areas like fields. When we notice that, we can go into the woods and you'll notice the temperature is usually quite a bit cooler than it would be in an area where there's an open field. Same thing happens out on ice when you go ice fishing. You go out on a lake, you'll notice that it's quite a bit cooler over top of the lake because there's no way for the lake itself to absorb that solar energy and heat up. Now it's happening very slowly, but the reflectivity is slowing that process. So quick quiz. Define an energy budget. What is an energy budget?
The amount of energy that you can keep.
Okay, the amount of energy that our planet gets, and not necessarily just keeps, but gets and uses on a daily basis. Okay? So an energy budget is the total distribution of energy to, from, and between Earth's various spheres. Alright, internal sources of energy. Remember, I am not going to require you to know timelines. I'm not going to require you to know 6.4 billion years ago. What I am going to ask, or the main point for this slide is, our planet, it has retained some internal heat. The internal heat is due to molecules being very close together and compacted in our planet. So as molecules are close and compacted, they're bumping into one another, causing friction. Friction produces heat. Also, radioactive decay is going to cause heat energy to be released. The decay of radioactive atoms still generates enough heat to keep Earth's interior hot, Much of the energy that is thought to have been produced from its formation is still retained within the interior. So the interior of our planet is fairly warm. That energy can be released at Earth's surface. If you know anybody that has a geothermal heating unit in their house, this uses energy from inside of our planet. Basically what it is, it's a big circuit where they dig a hole under the ground anywhere from 6 to 12 feet deep. Once you get below the surface layer of the ground, temperature remains fairly constant year-round. That constant temperature then can heat up water that is pumped into this circuit. The water is then pumped back into the house where it can be put into a condenser and heated a little bit more, and then it can be blown into the house as heat. It's a very cost-effective system once you have it installed and you've paid for the system. The problem is that it's very expensive to install. Each month your heating bill will be anywhere from $15 to $20 based on just simply running the pump. The system itself can cost $16,000 to $40,000 to put in, depending on the type of system that you put in. By the process of convection, the heat in Earth's interior is transferred through the layers of Earth and it's released off into our surface. So constantly there is energy being released at our surface, on our planet. Some of that happens just through convection, where it's just released through the surface. Some of that happens at areas where there's plates coming in contact with one another. Some of the heat energy has to be released in some areas, maybe in volcanoes. So all of those would be examples. External energy sources. The Earth's most important external energy source is the sun. We should be familiar with this. The majority of the energy that we use on our planet comes from the sun. The sun drives all biological processes on our planet. Without the sun, we would not have plants. If plants were not around, we wouldn't have those first level consumers, second level consumers, third level consumers.
So basically, if we didn't have the sun, we'd all die.
If we did not have the sun, life would not exist. Solar radiation warms Earth's atmosphere and its surface. The heating causes the movement of air masses. This generates winds and ocean currents. And then also chemical reactions on our planet require solar energy. So for example, the photosynthesis reaction. CO2, 6 CO2s, plus 6 H2Os, plus sunlight, need the sunlight for this process to go, for this chemical reaction to occur, gives us 6 O2 molecules plus C6H12O6, which is glucose. Without solar energy, the chemical reaction that supplies our planet with energy would not occur. Winds would not occur. Ocean currents would not occur. Therefore, without the sun, heat would not be distributed throughout our planet. Energy would not be distributed throughout our planet. Another important external source of energy is gravitational energy from the moon and sun. It helps to generate the tides that cause currents and drives the mixing of the ocean water. The picture that just popped up there shows some of the wind currents that are found on our planet. So from the last bullet, it shows how the energy from the sun helps to heat the equatorial regions. The equatorial regions, as they are heated, are slightly deflected due to the Coriolis effect, so it causes a curvature of the wind patterns on our planet. As we continue on in this lesson, we're going to go and we're going to talk about why coal is a fossil fuel, how petroleum and natural gas form, and how they are removed from Earth. We'll summarize the process of nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. We'll talk about how nuclear fission generates electricity. Non-renewable energy. A non-renewable resource is a resource that forms at a rate that is much slower than the rate in which we consume it. The things that we typically think about when we think about non-renewable energy resources are fossil fuels. A fossil fuel is a non-renewable energy resource that forms from the remains of organisms that lived long ago. I was not around to know that when they lived. I will not give you a timeline on when they lived. I am old, but I am not that old. I did not see them die. I did not see them get buried. I don't know how long ago it was that they were there. Examples include oil, coal, and natural gas. Much of the energy that we have on a daily basis, or that we use on a daily basis, comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So when we burn hydrocarbons, we break the chemical bonds of those elements, or of those compounds. As we break those chemical bonds, we release energy in the form of heat and light. One type of fossil fuel that we use a great deal of is coal. Coal is produced through this process called carbonization. It is fairly complex. We're going to simplify it. It occurs when partially decomposed plant materials are buried in swamp. That swamp eventually kind of creates this mucky, dark colored dirt called peat. As bacteria consume some of the peat and release the gases methane and carbon dioxide, the contents of the peat become more and more carbon. So a higher percentage of it ends up being carbon because the impurities of oxygen and hydrogen are released. Peat remains if conditions are not optimal for carbonization, and it may be used as an energy source. An example of peat being used is, or can be discussed when we talk about a section of property up between Elma and Vestaburg. It used to be that there was kind of a big peat bog right there, and the people that owned the property ended up having another company that came in and got a license to be able to remove the peat. What happened was the area that was basically a wetland, swamp, bog type thing, where it was just a lot of dirt and a lot of mud, they actually had this company come in and mine all of the peat out. Peat is used on golf courses because it's very nutrient rich. It's used to fertilize plants. The peat, after it was mined, left a big depression in the ground because water was in that area as well. It was soft, it was mucky, it was very much like a swamp. They took all the peat out and they created this really large, about 10-acre lake. That 10-acre lake was created, and the people that owned the property were also paid a very substantial amount of money for the peat being removed from their property. So they got a lake, a 10-acre lake on their property out of the deal, and they got paid for the removal of the peat. Most of the time, in order to create a 10-acre lake, you'd have to pay somebody thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars in order for them to come in and do it. In this case, they've got paid in order to get a lake on their property. It's kind of an interesting way that people have used peat in the past. Formation of petroleum and natural gas. Petroleum and natural gas are mixtures of hydrocarbons. So remember, we talked about how there's long chains of carbon atoms lined up one right after another, and then usually there's hydrogen attached to those carbon atoms, and this creates these different types of hydrocarbons or different types of fossil fuels that we use. They are formed when heat and pressure cause chemical changes to the remains of microorganisms in plants. Petroleum and natural gas deposits. They're very important sources of energy for us. We use them in transportation, farming, and a lot of other industries. They're mined from permeable sedimentary rock. Remember, a permeable rock is one that allows these substances to flow through it. They've got empty spaces between the rocks that allow, once we put a pipe down or we put some type of pump down, we're easily able to pump it back to the surface. The petroleum then accumulates beneath a cap rock, and all the empty space below that fills to form a oil reservoir, and then natural gas rises above that petroleum because it's less dense than oil and water. So the picture right here shows this. So we've got an impermeable cap rock right here. There's water usually in that area. All of the decomposing or broken down microorganisms turn into oil. Some of that oil gives off gas in the form of natural gas. Natural gas is less dense than the oil, so it sits on top of the oil. The oil is less dense than the water, so it sits on top of the water. This picture over here just shows another formation that occurs usually along a fault line. So you get an area where a cap rock or an impermeable layer kind of slides in over top of an area where water, oil, and natural gas have been forming. Oil traps. When a well is drilled into an oil reservoir, the petroleum and natural gas often flow to the surface. Most of the time when this occurs, a pump is not necessarily needed because that cap rock causes a large amount of overlying pressure on top of the oil reserves. So you drill a well into it, the oil just basically starts spewing out.
Is that how you get pictures of like the oil just coming out of the ground?
Yep, absolutely. That's how those pictures of oil just kind of spewing out of the ground, that's where they come from. A well was drilled, and because of the overlying pressure being released, the oil just continues to spew out that well. To begin with, it is a little bit wasteful because it just spews out, and then they quickly put a pump on it, or they put a cap on it that then allows it to pump to a new location. Excellent question. How come what can't be faster? I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. I think the drilling process just requires you to have it open at one point. So after the pressure of the overlying rock is removed, fluids rise up and out through the well. Fossil fuels, like minerals, are one of the main sources of energy, but also remember they are a non-renewable resource. So we are using these fossil fuels up much quicker than in the speed at which they can replenish themselves.
Do you have a time when we'll run out of it?
There is a timeline on the amount of time that we will have many fossil fuel reserves left. The thought is that we are in about a 100-year decline right now. We have approximately 100 years left if we continue using fossil fuels at the rate in which we're using them right now. Crude oil, or unrefined petroleum, is also used in the production of plastics, synthetic fabrics, and rubber, medicines, waxes, chemical fertilizers, detergents, shampoos, and many other substances or products that we use on a daily basis. So crude oil is pumped out of the ground. You've probably seen wells that are similar to this up around the Rosebush area. You drive north of Mount Pleasant a little ways and you can usually start smelling the natural gas that's being pumped out of the ground. So that's a well. Coal is the most abundant fossil fuel. 2/3 of the known deposits of coal occur in the United States, Russia, and China. Coal mining is, or was, a very big industry in parts of West Virginia and the Virginias, around areas of the Appalachian Mountains. Currently, as you get out towards Wyoming and some of the other Rocky Mountain states, it is very, very large production, or it is a very large production. They actually have rail cars that run right past the areas where they're mining it out. They basically are scooping it right out of the ground, dumping it in rail cars. The train moves a little bit forward, dump it in the next rail car, and eventually when the rail's completely filled up, the train's completely filled up, they just ship it out to wherever it's going. There are certain areas where it's close enough to energy facilities, coal burning plants, where they dump it inside of a rail car, and that rail car just goes right to the coal burning facility. They dump out the rail car at the coal burning facility, load up that coal burning plant, They produce electricity with the coal that's being burnt, and the electricity runs out to the homes in the area. Oil shale. Oil shale is relatively abundant. It contains a large amount of petroleum in it. The cost of mining oil from shale is far greater than the present cost of recovering oil from other sedimentary rocks. However, because of the costs of petroleum products and crude oil, because they've increased in the last few years, they actually have found ways, and they are actually starting to mine oil shale and pull out some of those oils from this type of rock and use it for production of things. So it is a up-and-coming industry. As the cost of crude oil continues to rise, it will become more and more feasible for them to take oils out of oil shale. So caprock. What is caprock? What is a caprock?
Rock that caps all the water, the oil, the other thing.
Yeah, excellent. It is, like we saw in that picture, it is a layer of impermeable rock at the top of an oil or natural gas bearing formation. And once we drill through that caprock, because of the overlying pressure of it, oil or natural gas just spews out of the well. Nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is getting pretty popular in some other countries. The United States has not taken the stance that we want to produce very much nuclear energy. You start talking about some of the nuclear reactor meltdowns in the past, and our country has really kind of gone away from actually producing those. So the energy that's produced from nuclear reactions is called nuclear energy. Scientists discovered that atoms had smaller fundamental parts. So for a long time we thought an atom was just kind of a circular model like we saw in our chemistry unit. But we ended up discovering that atoms were actually made up of protons, electrons, and neutrons. And when we break them apart, we create energy in the form of heat and light specifically. So we break those parts apart through some nuclear reactions, and we use the energy to power a reactor. In the United States, the nuclear reactor facilities that we have are very, very, very well maintained. When you talk about places like Russia, you might think about Chernobyl. Chernobyl was a meltdown that occurred in Russia. That meltdown occurred due to the fact that the Russian authorities built a very cheap reactor. That very cheap reactor did not have the safeguards on it that some of them in the United States have. So the process in which we produce nuclear energy is this process called nuclear fission. So nuclear fission is a process by which the nucleus of a heavy atom splits into two or more fragments, and this process releases neutrons and energy. On the following slide, I've got a picture that explains this process or goes through this process. So when the nucleus splits, it releases additional neutrons and energy. The newly released neutrons begin a chain reaction. So those neutrons, they go and they hit other large atoms. As the neutrons hit other large atoms, they break those large atoms apart. More energy and more neutrons are released. Those neutrons go out and they hit other atoms, and they continue this chain reaction. It's important that when we use a nuclear reactor that this reaction is controlled. Can anybody think of a nuclear reaction that occurs that is uncontrolled? What do we call that?
Explosions.
It is an explosion. Anybody know specifically where we have seen that before?
C4? What is it?
Not C4.
Volcano.
Nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are an uncontrolled nuclear reaction where energy and heat and light is released.
What would happen if we made a
So if left uncontrolled, a fission reaction will escalate quickly. It may result in an explosion. As was mentioned, it would be an explosion of nuclear proportions. It would be like a nuclear bomb. Controlled reactions produce heat that can be used to generate electricity. So what is the cause of a chain reaction during nuclear fission? What sets off this reaction? Not just the atom, specifically a part of an atom. The neutron in the nucleus causes this reaction. So as neutrons strike neighboring nuclei, the nuclei split and release additional neutrons that strike other nuclei and cause the chain to continue. So how fission generates electricity? A nuclear reactor is specialized equipment in which a controlled nuclear fission reaction is carried out. The important part to this is that it is controlled. We use control rods inside of the reactor that collect some of these fission or some of these neutrons that are being shot off in this reaction. Those neutrons that are collected don't cause the chain reaction to occur and escalate quickly. So currently we use uranium-235 or U-235. It's the only naturally occurring element that's used for nuclear fission. We can synthetically in a lab make things like plutonium that we can actually use for a reaction, but typically we use uranium-235. The ore is mined and processed into fuel pellets, and those fuel pellets have a very high uranium-235 content. The uranium-enriched pellets are placed into rods to make fuel rods, and then bundles of the fuel rods are bombarded by neutrons to get the reaction to start. Done. So the resulting chain reaction from nuclear fission causes the fuel rods to become very hot. So heat is released, light is released. We then pump water around the fuel rods to absorb and remove the heat. The water that is pumped around the fuel rods is a separate circuit from the water that is actually used in the generators. The reason that it is separate is because the water then becomes very radioactive. You don't want radioactive material coming in contact with individuals that are working on or working with the reactor itself. The water is then pumped into a second circuit where it becomes steam and turns the turbines that power the power plant, and we generate the electricity that is then sent out to homes. A third water circuit carries away the excess heat and releases it into the environment. So we saw earlier in a picture where there was some really big smokestacks. Those smokestacks are the area where the heat energy is simply released off into the environment. What you're seeing there is not air pollution. What you're seeing there is steam that is being released off into the atmosphere. Alright, so this diagram shows a fission reaction. It shows a neutron being shot into a uranium-235 atom, into the nucleus of it. As it hits that nucleus, it breaks apart into two products. More neutrons are released. Those neutrons go and hit other atoms, breaking them apart, releasing more energy and more neutrons. There are a number of advantages and disadvantages to nuclear fission. Advantages are that when we use nuclear fission as a reaction, we burn no fossil fuels to produce no air pollution. So when we're burning fossil fuels, we're releasing different carbon compounds into the atmosphere. Carbon compounds are thought to be causing some type of warming in our atmosphere. They're thought to trap heat. When we aren't burning fossil fuels, we aren't producing that air pollution. They do, however, produce harmful radioactive materials. Those radioactive materials have very long half-lives, meaning that they don't decompose or break down very quickly. So the wastes have to be stored for thousands of years. And specifically, we have sites in the United States that are in limestone, very, very deep underneath the ground, basically caverns, that we take these used fuel rods, We take them, we store them there where they cannot release the nuclear energy or the byproducts off into the environment. The waste products give off harmful doses of radiation. The radiation destroy plant and animal cells. They cause harmful changes to the genetic material of living cells. Some of the nuclear accidents that have occurred have been known to cause genetic abnormalities in people and offspring. Usually it is not the growth of additional appendages. Usually it's things that are detrimental to the organism surviving. So it would be lack of appendages. It would be lack of certain parts of the body, or it would be large tumorous growths and things like that that would cause the organism to not survive. Probably not being born with extra body parts. That would be a very rare thing. Most of the time it's like cancerous lesions and growths and cancerous cell production. Nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is the reaction that occurs on the sun. And the reason we're going to talk about this right here is so that we can look at the difference between fission and fusion. So nuclear fusion is the process by which nuclei of small atoms combine to form new, more massive nuclei. This process releases energy. So when we fuse two things together, we're combining them. If we're going through a fission reaction, we're breaking things apart. Fusion is combining, fission is breaking them apart. All of the energy that reaches Earth from the sun is produced by a nuclear fusion reaction. So we can produce a fission reaction on Earth with a nuclear reactor. We cannot produce a fusion reaction on Earth. The sun is the only thing, or stars are the only thing we know of that produce a fusion reaction. Fusion reactions only occur at temperatures of more than 15 million degrees Celsius. So that's part of the reason why we can't get this reaction to occur on the planet. Scientists are studying ways to try to get it to happen. The only byproduct of a fusion reaction are helium nuclei. And helium nuclei, as we know, are harmless to human cells. Probably not very good for you to suck down a whole lot of helium into your throat. The reason that it causes your voice to become so squeaky is because it tightens up all of those muscles that are used, your vocal cords that are used for speaking. So your voice becomes very squeaky. Probably not a good thing for you to continue to cause those muscles to tense up with helium, but it is not going to cause you permanent cellular damage. The picture that you see here is the parts of a nuclear reactor. So we're going back to that fusion reaction, that fission reaction. So the fission reaction has one circuit right here where we're pumping water around the energy rods, the uranium rods. That water is heated. There's usually a pressurizer on there to keep the entire circuit from breaking. Then there's a second circuit that is used to heat water, turn it to steam. The steam is used to turn a turbine. That turbine powers electricity or creates electricity through a generator. And then the excess energy or the excess heat is released through a third circuit. So this third circuit would go out to some type of smokestack that would then release that steam off into the atmosphere. So those three circuits work together to get this reaction to occur. It is important to note that in the United States, when we create a nuclear reactor, we put a very large containment structure around it, and that large containment structure is usually very, very, very thick with concrete, and it helps to house this. If there was some type of nuclear meltdown or some type of reactor breakdown, everything is contained within this large concrete structure so that it wouldn't get out in the environment, so that uranium or that radiation would not get off and and harm cells to organisms. The Chernobyl accident, if you go to the town of Chernobyl still in Russia, there is still nuclear fallout there. There is still nuclear radiation that is being emitted from that location. It is not safe for people to be in that area without specialized suits. So this has been, for the United States, this has been kind of a touchy subject as to whether we should create energy with this, because people are afraid that if we have a meltdown, if we have a reactor that ends up broken, we will end up with the same problems that happened in Chernobyl. Now, one thing that is important for us to note is Chernobyl sat on a very large lake. They used the lake to cool the reactor. When it broke down, all of that radiation ended up in the lake right next to Chernobyl. So not only did the environment get affected, but all of the organisms that were in that lake also were affected by it. People were using that as a drinking water supply. People were using it as a water supply. It took quite a while for the Russian government to even admit that a reactor meltdown occurred. And so people were drinking the water, they were showering in it, and it became a very large problem, not only for the people that were living there, but for if they survived the meltdown, when they moved away, they started having children. Their children ended up with genetic abnormalities because of the problems that were associated with that radiation and the genetic material that made them up.